I can switch. All right, here we go. It really is. All right. So let me. Oh, now all of my screens are tiny and to the very far left. This is not the right screen. Yeah, so the lighting talk. Okay, here it is. All right. Slideshow. All right. Feel free to jump in here. I am not an expert, but I've implemented this recently and was excited about it, and now I regret it. But here I am. So SAML really is an acronym, but still kind of a dirty bad word for some people. At least makes me wince. And devise is maybe doubly so. A lot of people are interested in other authentication providers, but it works and it's worked for a long time, so I like it. Not that afraid to admit it. How many people know what SAML is? Like, have you used it? Okay, good. But only one person might be more expert than me because it's funky. It stands for Security Assertion Markup Language. It's a single sign-on mechanism, XML based, and it's really about transferring authorization and identity data from authentication, not authorization, authentication from an IDP, the identity provider, to a service provider. So an identity provider would be FusionAuth or Okta. Service provider would be your website, my website. It's a way to take out standard device authentication with the username and password and delegate it to somebody else if you want. You also can have your own version of that as well. And so you can have a service provider or an IDP initiated login. We'll get into that a little bit more, but it's kind of flexible in that way, which I think is nice. So again, the identity provider is the one that performs that authentication, passes a big payload over to an authentication endpoint at the service provider level. Service provider sort of trusts that with some certificate fingerprinting, authorizes, and then logs them in. A lot of us have probably used SSO in one way or another, so that hopefully makes general sense. And I just skipped twice, so hold. Go back. This is just, wow, now I'm 3 up. Okay. So this is a little bit what it looks like. As a user, you would potentially log into the service provider application. This is the first option for service provider initiated logins. So you could log in, the service provider will create a SAML request. It's a XML authn request that is structured and then sent to the IDP. The IDP then authenticates the user and generates a return around response and sends it back to the service provider. You then say, yes, I accept that, and the certificate matches, and then authenticates and logs you in. It's an interesting round trip. But what is really nice about that is that you get this sort of central authentication manager, right, that a lot of providers have nowadays. And on top of that, if say you are working somewhere and you want to go out to a third party, you could have a dashboard and be clicking links to then go into that other service provider application, if that makes sense. Another way you can do service provider initiated login, which is what I do, I identify based on subdomain. And so if you come to a subdomain that is enabled with an IDP and a SAML setup, there's a link that says, hey, log in with your provider. You click that, it's a simple redirect that just sends you to the IDP. And then that would be where either you're logged in and you're sent back right away with this payload that's invisible to you as the user, or you would then log in at the IDP level and then that same payload would come back through. So you kind of see they're similar, but you can create this payload in the first option. And that I'll show later is that XML payload that helps with a little bit more authentication and trust. There. Did I push next? Okay. And the IDP initiated login cuts all of this service provider stuff out. You're authenticated. You have that potential dashboard in wherever you're working kind of way. Like, yes, I want to go to my website. And you click a link that says go to Benefix where I work, and then it sends that SAML response sort of separate from the service provider and authenticates, if that makes sense. So he just kind of chops off all the service provider stuff that's up there before. However, an IDP initiated login is actually man-in-the-middle susceptible. So it's something to think about if you're setting this up. Someone could sit in the middle there, steal the assertion that's being sent from the IDP, and then grab it and pass that to the service provider. I don't know how common that is, especially with encrypted communication now, but when I was initially researching this for setting it up at the place that I work, this was one of the articles that popped up and I was like, oh God, I can't use this.
Right. Is this like a nation state kind of attack, or someone would be able to like poison your DNS, like coming into the service provider?
Maybe, I don't, that seems like,
You have 3 minute middle on this, so you would need to intercept your SSL communication, so it would be a nation state with a already recent cert.
Yeah.
Sit in the middle and be able to decode your SSL.
So they'd be sitting in front of your app server.
They would be intercepting all traffic between your app server, well, the internet and your app server.
Right.
That would be one approach to do it. Other one would be really bad SSL certs. Why? Yeah.
There's a JWT too, and they would have to crack that as well. So
so it's out there as a potential, but it seems unlikely that you're gonna be intercepted by a nation state in what we all do, hopefully. Yeah, maybe not so much. So this is what that sort of service provider packet would look like. It's XML sent to the IDP. Some of the ways that came up as ways to try to kind of double authenticate is pass an ID and then a relay state, which could be a redirect, could be a random value. And the redirect would be like, hey, you're authenticated, pass back where you want me to go afterwards. So like maybe I don't want to go to the dashboard, I want to go to my edit page, edit my user information. That could be what you pass in the relay state. And so you would store that before you create the service provider packet to send over and then authenticate it when it came back. Which for me is like if the return value from the IDP is intercepted, that would still be there. So I don't quite understand how that works. If anybody wants to jump in on that, but that was one of the ways. I was like, I don't know that it wouldn't still be in the response, but it was called out as a way to add a little bit of extra checking from the service provider send. XMLNS is a namespace, and so the metadata will come up later, sort of describes how the service provider is set up. The issuer is how you identify the IDP. I should have called this IDP-provider, which I do later. And it's something that's usually passed over from the IDP to say, hey, like this is me and this has already been set up on the back end, and like, trust this based on the cert as well. But it's one way you find if you have multiple SAML setups. The response, I grabbed one briefly. It's much bigger than this because it's an encoded, very long string, but this is all it looks like. I've spent a lot of time looking at logs for this, actually. It's a fun time. One login has a really nice set of tools at samltool.com. And so you would take the previous kind of string there, put it in the top part of this field, and then decode and inflate and be like, boop, here's your XML. And it looks like this loosely. So here's the decoded response that I've muddled a little bit and taken some out. But you have kind of that response ID at the top, when it was issued, some of the identification of the protocol, and namespacing there. The IDP provider, which was Contesso on the last one for whatever reason, where I grabbed it from, is again how you identify who you're working with if you have multiple identity providers. The signature is where the cert is stored. Again, didn't want to drop that in here, but it's an X509 encoded cert, if that makes sense. And later I'll show you a little bit of what you do to then store that kind of cert matchup on the service provider end. But that's where that is in the signature body. And then down below that is sort of the assertion of the user profile data. So like where your first name, last name, email, and all that would end up showing up. Very exciting stuff there. Okay. And so when you want to bring this into the device, one of the options that I found that seems pretty well followed and starred and all of that is, did I skip a slide? I did. It's called devise SAML authenticatable. And so its dependencies are devise, of course, and then Ruby SAML, which does most of the lifting here. And their docs are also fairly good if you want to look at more of how you structure SAML requests. Standard install, gem devise SAML authenticatable bundle, or however else you would install. For those of you who use devise, you just add a bunch of attributes like this in the model that you're going to add this to. So it could be lockable if you're going to let it be locked if they do too many. There's a bunch of different ways. Does everybody know how that works in device? I got 2 nods, but there's 15 of you. Anyways, there's a way of saying attributes for all this different authentication options, and this is the way you add SAML authenticatable in this sense. In the routes file, you add device for users. That gives you the post route, which is where you post that big chunk SAML response to the metadata, sometimes apparently called the audience, where it sort of defines how the service provider is expecting the data and is set up. And so if you get deeper into it, it would provide more metadata for somebody who is looking how to set up a specific integration. The sign-in is like a service provider initiated login. It could be that you have your username and password there, and then you send the packet over. Or like I talked about earlier, I have a link. We just say, hey, sign in with your IDP. And then I've overridden the routes in this sort of way where I say, all right, call this a SAML session. The controller is a custom namespace controller, because I had to do some overriding of some of the parts of how SAML worked for a more customized lookup for the IDP that I needed to do based on subdomain. SAML by default does that issuer that I keep calling out as the lookup by default. The IDP identity ID is what they call it. And so for me, because it's all subdomained and we had initial setup was only 1 client, and I had to move to make it flexible for 2, but the first client wasn't getting back to me to work that way. And so I had to make sure it was like subdomain set up well enough to like be customized for the lookup, which you'll see a little bit later. The configuration for the gem is you can create a user if you want, or you can disable that. So you can have all your users already. If you don't want any create to happen, you can update the user based on the attributes passed in. You can set the default user key, which for me was email. So similar, that's the username for the login of where I work. I changed the spacing so it fit on 1 line. But if you're going to do an SLO, a single logout to the IDP, this is where you use the SAML session index key to identify where the session was stored and how to send it over, I believe. This is not something I'm using, so that's my understanding. The subject part is also a little confusing, but I think that there is an attribute sometimes called subject in there as the identifier piece, but I wanted the gem to pull email out of the assertion and then find the user by that instead. So this is how I said, no, don't use that, use email. And so that works for me. The IDP settings adapter is how you do multi-IDP setups. Default is not to be set because you're generally probably hopefully only doing 1. And then for the route helper prefix is nice because then you don't override the defaults that Devise provides, and it inserts SAML into there before user, so you don't get new user session path that overrides your HTML kind of version of authentication. This is kind of a single setup that's also in the Devise.rb. Like I said, the Ruby SAML docs are quite good. And that's how I tried to piece together all of the other options that I'm not using for this. The kind of local auth URL there is where it's posted to. The binding is the post there. You can see it's like a very long protocol to end up saying, hey, it's a post body. The format is transient, but I've seen it also as email address camel cased. So that's probably more correct for my use case, but transient I think is like a little bit like, oh, it's a string, it could be whatever you want. The metadata again is where it provides sort of context for the service provider's setup as far as this is going to work. These ones are optional, and a deeper dive, the SLO is that single logout URL if the IDP was going to allow that. I don't know what the authent context is. I literally looked it up last night and I forgot.
It's optional.
Yeah, it's optional. I know that because I'm not using it. The single sign-on is the IDP's URL. So for the subdomain that I was talking about with the link, that's where I just linked them to, is that URL. The cert fingerprint is where it takes the X509 certificate is what keeps coming up. You run it through the SAML tool encoder. It gives you this fingerprint that looks like this. It's 3 times as long as this, I think. And that's how it matches up in the payload where the cert comes in, and then it compares it to this fingerprint. And you say, hey, use an algorithm. And this one uses SHA-1 by default, which is cryptographically broken. So you don't really want to do that. You should do 256. But in like the basic cases, it's okay, but not ideal. Oh, yeah. And I highlighted all these and then forgot to click through. as I did it again. And then this is how you sort of provide that mapping. So if the XML payload was coming in defined as a UID, email name, given name, you can map those to the attributes on your end. And so it's a nice translation tool. So I store email, in my case, in username and email. So there's kind of a double save there. This is not what I'm using, but it's one way I overrode some of what was happening by default with SAML payloads. And then getting towards the end, this is like the last slide. This is how I set, or second to last slide maybe. This is how I set up for multiple IDP integration. And what you end up doing is overriding or blanking out all of the defaults in Devise.rb because you're going to do a lookup later via this adapter to say, all right, we're looking at the IDP identity ID. Again, it's by that issuer XML piece in the payload generally, but I do it by the subdomain that's being used. So yeah, you blank all this out, but some of these are the same. And then the delay is brutal.
Oh, we've got 3 seconds.
Why?
You doctor running?
No, I don't have that much money. Close everything down. So this is one implementation of the adapter. So this is the from their documentation where you just have a case statement. And again, this is that issuer bit. It passes it in automatically, and you can do a case statement lookup and then just define per IDP how you want it to be set up. It also passes in the request. So there's another way to do it. We could do request.subdomain and do a lookup, which I don't do, but that's okay. And then this is a little more of what my setup looks like. This is the bare minimum if you're going to be setting this up for multiple people, where you need the SSO target URL, where you send people to authenticate at the IDP, that cert fingerprint, the IDP identity ID, which I use to look up the IDP, and the callback address, which is used to just sort of define like, hey, here's the subdomain dot Benefix and the standard kind of routes that the gem provides. The adapter has the same as the default one here as the self.settings, a class method. And that is how I do the lookup based on the identity ID that's passed in. Higher level up, I do look it up by subdomain and then pass it in here. And then you just return those settings. And so you can see this is an instance method for the found IDP setup that's stored. And so that's how it becomes flexible in this way, which is nerve-wracking, but also nice. And that's generally the lightningest of lightning talks I could do for SAML on device.
I have one major question.
I hope I can answer it.
Well, maybe you can introduce somebody else's. So what is the fundamental difference between a SAML and an OAuth 2? Because the exact same, like the protocol over the wire would be exactly the same, just a different message body format.
One uses XML.
I wouldn't be surprised if they're very similar. I haven't looked at OAuth for a couple of years.
For one protocol, you can charge $20 a user a month for your service.
I'm like the name, that's the particular audience, you know, okay, it's basically the same, like even that little secret is like just your code that you have the URL. Okay.
Yeah, it may end up being, yeah, that's mostly just because it's XML. But the people who are requesting that we do this are enterprise level clients.
Yeah.
And so that would make sense that we're like, oh, SAML and XML,
I
we know
mean,
that.
SAML's been around longer than.
Yeah.
Yeah, but from a concept perspective, it sounds exactly the same.
Yeah, I think it is, and I think it's also open, just like OAuth, which the O stands for, right? Open authentication.
Two.
I think it's log users of sample. The config you can pass the windows to really quick, you can do a find or create by user, and then there's like an option for time drift. And it seems like you never need time drift, but that's what you do, and then we can log in. But that's like really helpful if you do like every second drift. It's probably good enough.
Yeah, and so like I was kind of pointing out as I ran through that, there are a lot of other configurations. I don't know that OAuth, like I said, I haven't used OAuth in a while. I don't know how much, the overlap is there if you're going to dive deeper, especially if you're in an enterprise level, you may want to be locking things down in a different way.
Google says that SAML is more user focused and that OAuth is, you can do the same thing that SAML can do. Plus you can also access specific resources from the identity provider. So it'd be the equivalent of like connecting your Google Calendar to another app. You'd be getting both the identity from Google and the calendar resources.
And I was sort of equating it to, is like when you go to a site, and it's like sign in with Google, sign in with Twitter, sign in with GitHub. That would more be OAuth, not SAML for whatever reason.
That's all OAuth.
Yeah. And so I don't know why, but that is like what he's saying, where you're like, just use my identity that I've already set up at
Yeah, those are
GitHub.
IDP.
Yeah.
They're almost IDP.
SAML is usually when you like, my wife works for BBSD, and when she logs in, she gets a page that has all these buttons on it, like go to your insurance, go to your classroom, go to your, and all of that is over SAML. So I think like when you click, when you're somewhere and it just like automatically takes you somewhere else and log in, that's usually SAML. I think OAuth can do that, but it's usually SAML. But if you're like on the other site and you say, I'd like to log in with my Google, that's almost always OAuth.
Right. And but that's a similar flow to the service provider initiate login as well. And that's like when I do the link on the site, I set it up where we have a business Google Drive, a SAML app you can just add for free, and it's the same thing. It just is like, click, go there, oh, you already signed in and back.
Yeah, I'm not sure I've ever seen OAuth do the, I'm on a dashboard and it takes me there and logs me in. Every
Yeah.
time I've seen that, it takes me to the site and then like silently sends me back to go do the login and then come back.
So
But
that,
the OAuth doesn't
You
support
can do
that.
that with SAML, like you can check username, and if it's like matching it, meaning that
Yeah.
you know it's a SAML user, you can kick them over to SAML and come back.
Yeah, I think they can both do both pretty comfortably.
That's why I see login forms without a password. Because they need the username first to tell you whether they want a password.
But how do you log them out then, if you don't want to log them out?
The SLO.
Yeah, but what if you don't want to log out then? If you're using 90 for other services.
so that's like cut off on mine. You can't do that. I don't send that back to ADP, but you can log out of my website. So that just clears out your session.
Right.
That is set from SAML, but then I just redirect to my homepage. Instead of saying, hey, I'm logging out, also IDP logs them out, and I'll send you to them.
Yeah, that would be like logging out of Google, and then anyone who used Google's auth for your app, then it would automatically log you out of
Yeah.
your application.
If you have shared machines for your client, they have to do that SLO, because if someone else sits down.
Right. So again, like in an enterprisey bigger way, there's like a lot more customization you could do. And yeah, and I will call out that Fusion Auth has some documentation on this as well, so I thought that was kind of fun as a sponsor. Shut there. Any other questions, thoughts? Cool.
We support your motion, Lee.
Thank you. I'm like vibrating right now. Yeah, and there's a lot more you could talk about with this. There's a really cool this YouTube video is this guy is awesome. He works at I can't say it because
Give me the shirt.
yeah. Stop recording, then we can talk about it.